And you are live.
Thank you and good morning. I'm hereby calling to order the meeting of the Board of Regents for this special meeting. And I'd like to ask the Assistant Secretary to handle the roll call and presumably announce a quorum.
Thank you. Chair Fleury.
Here.
Regent Harris.
Here.
Regent Balducci. Absence is noted. Regent Budd.
Here.
Regent Gray Kemp. Absence is noted. Regent Howery.
Here.
Regent Jimenez.
Here.
Regent Porth.
Here.
Regent Ryan.
Here.
Regent Santiago. Absence is noted. Regent Wright.
Here.
Professor Blitz.
Present.
Professor Sasanker.
As I indicated earlier, I want to state Dr. Sasanker's regrets at not being able to attend this meeting from the beginning. She has been scheduled on short notice by the CSU System Office for a required meeting at the same time as the special meeting, which she would have preferred to attend. Hopefully, she'll be able to join the meeting before it ends, in which case she could be marked as present.
Professor Blitz. Interim Commissioner Bartolomeo. Absence is noted. Commissioner Giuttani. Absence is noted. Commissioner Lehman. Absence is noted. Commissioner Designate Russell Tucker. Absence is noted. And Chief Workforce Officer Villeras. Absence is noted. Chair Fleury, you have a quorum.
Thank you and good morning again, everyone. We are live streaming on YouTube and also recording, so it'll be available for future reference. So to those viewing live on YouTube, good morning and thanks for your time today. And those catching up, nice to have you catch up with us. So let me ask for a motion to adopt the agenda.
Moved.
So moved.
And a second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, we have an agenda. Thank you. Quick housekeeping note. There is in the meeting packet a draft of the 2022 board calendar with its many meetings, committees, and the board itself. As always, we want to make sure as many people as possible can attend at least a reasonable sample of those meetings. So please review that and let the Assistant Secretary know if you have any concerns. It'll be on the agenda for adoption at our December board meetings. We're all on the same page about what our calendar is for next year. Today's meeting is extremely important to our work because it pulls us out of the naturally and inherently narrow lens of our local Connecticut perspective to also understand trends and conditions in the larger world of public higher ed. To be sure, one of the great values of our small state is that we can all be more familiar with its farthest reaches and their needs than we might be in a very large state. It's one of the things I like about Connecticut. And in fact, we could even say the same in comparing ourselves to a very large metropolis that is bigger than our entire state. But the advantages of our much smaller field don't add up to much unless we really understand the wider context within which we operate. In a closely integrated corridor here in New England and amid 49 other states. Those who count on our colleges and universities, students, their families, employers, the state, are not confined to, in real life, by the state line or by our Connecticut way of doing things, sadly. So we need to understand what others are experiencing and doing, and we can learn from them. And we can sharpen our own focus on areas that give our state a competitive advantage. So while we are an educational system that focuses on teaching, this can be a rich and valuable learning experience that adds perspective for all of us to consider. It is a best practice of governance to engage in this kind of learning, and I know I look forward to it. I hope you do too. President Cheng and the team have worked hard to organize an informative hour for us, and I'll turn it over to him for introductions and a little about the format today. President Cheng?
Thank you, Chair Fleury. I appreciate it. So the first thing I'll say, and I'll try to be brief, is I want to thank the board and our presenters. Our presenters obviously are going to bring a lot of value to us, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But for the board, your continued engagement, your support, your will to continue to improve and try to help our system every time. It's really, we just a great deal of gratitude for that. And in that vein, I'll just say, I'll echo what Chair Fleury just said, which is, this is part of our job, is to constantly look not just within, but outside of our walls, outside of our state, to understand where we are. And I think it helps to ground us in that, we're not alone in many of the challenges. The higher education landscape is changing rapidly along with our society. And so the paradigms have shifted, the pressures, the basically all the different responsibilities that might have been in place 10, 20, 30 years ago. So much has changed now. And I think we want to continue to fine tune our operations and always look for ways to be better, with the understanding that Connecticut is unique, our system is unique, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a great deal that we can learn, because there are similarities and there are other best practices and models out there. And so I think that's great for the board. It's great for us as leadership and management. It's great for our entire system to know that we're constantly out there looking, listening, learning. So with that, let me please introduce our speakers for today, our presenters, Sally Johnstone and Ames McGinnis from NCHEMS. Without further ado, if I may, I'll pass it over to Sally, if that's okay, Chair Fleury. I would like to pass it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Cheng. We were asked to offer some information about a perspective that would help you all as board members as you move forward. Yeah, thank you, Alice. So there's me and Ames. And I'm going to just start with an overview of what we're going to go through, and we're going to try and do this as quickly as possible so we have an opportunity to respond to any questions that you may have. First, we're going to start, excuse me, with a little bit of a comparison with other state systems, then talk about how systems are evolving into a framework of much more systemness for meeting the challenges of state goals and otherwise needing to really pay attention to what's going on. And as Chancellor Cheng noted, higher ed's changing, and it's changing fast. So we will also then go into a review of some policy tools that system leaders have and some common challenges facing system boards. And then offer some examples of a system that's realigning their capacities to meet new realities. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Ames, and then I'll pipe in a little bit later.
Okay, then we turn to the first slide, please. I think the comments by Chairman Fleury and President Cheng actually introduced this point, which is really important. From a personal point of view, frankly, I would not have had a career following university systems if this slide was not a problem. I've been called in more times over the last many years to a state that has been trying to unravel itself because a legislator has said, oh, well, I'd like to do what California did. I'd like to do what another state did, and I just enacted it here to solve all the problems. So it's a very common practice for people to say, oh, well, the neighbor state does it this way, why don't we do it that way? And it just underscores how important it is for you to do exactly what you've been describing, to really understand the uniqueness of Connecticut and to really understand within your own context the variations in geography and culture and history, and understand that the problems that you're solving will be specific to that. There are certainly lessons to be drawn, and if I just say that an overall message of what we're conveying is that the kind of initiatives which you in fact are leading right now are in fact at the forefront of what systems are doing. That is to say, they're really, higher education has got to address issues from a systemic point of view. And the truth is that is exceptionally hard work. So in fact, a lesson that you will convey is that this is not hard, this is hard work, but it requires really staying the course on the overall vision that you're involved. I mean, if there's any message from other states. So if I can turn to the next slide, please. This will just give you a perspective about how important systems are. If you talk with your neighbors in Connecticut and say, do they understand that each of the institutions is part of a system? Frankly, you're likely to get a blank stare. People know about their institutions. They know where their students, where their children went to school or where they went to school, but they really don't understand the basic point of this. Of all the students in public higher education, a very high percentage of those students are within these multi-campus systems. And that relates not only to institutions at a four-year level, but also within community colleges and community college districts and large multi-campus districts. Do the next slide. So if you really look at Connecticut, there are really 18 other states that have the kind of basic structure that Connecticut has. That is that there are two or more overall system governing boards responsible for all the institutions within the state. And then Connecticut is one of 9 states that actually includes both the universities and the community colleges. So that is a little bit different than other states, but it's not that uncommon. I just mentioned on the next slide the 2 states, Minnesota and Vermont. And I think you will instantly say to yourselves, oh yeah, that's fine, but boy, talking about states that are different than Connecticut. In some ways, they are different, but also there are lessons involved in that. I've just mentioned Minnesota, in which Sally served at one of the state universities, has a major challenge in just the scope of what they're dealing with. It's in fact incredible to be able to deal with that full range of institutions that took place. Putting together that system was almost an overnight dream of the Speaker of the House, of the President of the Senate, and he basically forced it through in a way that's been very difficult. So that's sort of similar, but dramatically different. The Vermont State College issue is obviously very different, but it does illustrate how important it is to think systemically. Having independent small institutions survive into these days is exceptionally difficult. And it also represents an example of why differentiation within a system is important. So to go, the other, just quickly, there are several other systems that have 2-year institutions that, again, there are messages from those, but they're really quite different from Connecticut. Then we can go to the next one. Now, just quickly, people will say, why don't we do Maine, or why don't we do Massachusetts, or what's different? Each of those places goes back to my first slide. They're really unique circumstances. Each of those states has gone through its own debates about restructuring over time. I started my life 100 years ago as chief of staff of the University of Maine system when it was first created, and went through all the trials of a major merger. But there are some lessons from that, and we'll come back to Maine as an example. The community colleges in that instance are separate from the major system, but still within the University of Maine system, there are major differentiation issues. And again, Massachusetts and New Hampshire and the other states that I've mentioned each one of them has a unique structure. And I think Sally and I would be pleased to answer questions about those states, about whether there are any lessons from them. I will say, however, I think with the exception of Maine and perhaps Vermont now, none of them have actually, I would put high on the list of dealing with issues from the kind of system point of view that we're describing. Perhaps the one exception is the State University of New York, SUNY. Nancy Zimpher, who was the former chancellor, is one of the leading proponents of the kind of systemness we're talking about. Nancy faced incredible challenges because SUNY is so integrated with state government and had such a vast span of responsibility. Bringing about change in that system is incredibly difficult. But Nancy was really a leader in the country and continues to be on the kind of systemist approach that we're talking about. So we'd be pleased to answer questions about those other states, but we wouldn't cite more than a couple of them as major examples of the kind of issues you're dealing with. Now I turn it over to Sally to talk about the evolution of systems.
Thank you, Ames. Most systems in states in this country, full state or portion of state or even metro areas, were developed in the 60s and 70s. And that was a time when the demand for higher education was huge. And the role of these systems were really designed to make sure there could be access for the citizens of the state to post-secondary education opportunities. But in addition to that, to do so in a rational manner, because they were serving the goals and the needs of the state and were funded by the state. One of the elements that has been typical within systems is to decrease the duplication of academic programs. And I would actually say maybe unnecessary duplication. But we're now involved in several states that are trying to figure out what that really means. In addition to that, the systems were put together sometimes to, as Ames has just said, curb the political pressure out of the legislature so that they could begin to say, look, we're trying to achieve some cost savings among our colleges and universities. And usually at that time, that took the form of financial services and particularly procurement services. And that's typical today, that there's a statewide structure for procurement. Can we go to the next slide, Alice? Okay, now we're in 2021, and there are very few states in the country, in fact, I think 2, that are not seeing already declines in enrollment, but projected to have even more intense declines, partially because of the way the world is working. We're having much lower birth rates, so a much lower number of people that are graduating from high school ready to move into post-secondary ed. In addition to that, states aren't footing the whole bill anymore. A lot of that has shifted to the burden to students and their families. In addition to that, because of these issues, there is intense competition for the same students, not only within a state, but between states. And anecdotally, I know Ames is going to talk more about Maine, but last year, they offered any student that had been accepted into their own state research university able to come to Maine for the same tuition that they would have paid in their own state. The competition is just growing, and that is not always good. We're seeing public institutions having real troubles maintaining their fiscal and otherwise service capacities. And the next slide. As a result of all of this, there's a real movement across the country to think more about systemness, if you will. And the concept is, it is only through some economies of scale that it's going to be possible to assure affordability of higher ed to the students that are in a particular state. And the other part of this is that the only growing demographic, even in Connecticut, are not those individuals who have typically been successful in post-secondary ed. So there's a need to figure out how to appropriately serve these underrepresented and underserved populations and do so to ensure their success. In addition to that, one of the things that comes up in state after state is, oh, here's a failing public institution, why not just close it? And if you close these state universities, you're wiping out the whole region. There won't be any teachers because people tend to go to university within about 50 miles of where they live. There won't be any nurses. There won't be any accountants. And that's a pretty radical position for anyone to take. The other thing that states are needing to do is push their institutions, and this is going on, to be much more responsive to workforce demands. It's not just, oh, we're going to do what we do, we have to move forward. So these systems are really critical, and linking the system goals and priorities to the state priorities is a very important step. And the systems are then the vehicle for developing the partnerships within, that is, the colleges and universities within the system, but also with outside of the system. So negotiations and ways in which K-12 is performing what they do to feed into what the colleges and universities need or what the students need to be able to be successful. Workforce development agencies, public and private institutions in terms of collaboration, and certainly state and regional economic development, but service providers as well. One of the most common things that systems do is group discounts for any institution or a state negotiated rate with the kinds of services that higher education institutions demand. Can we go to the next slide? And I'm going to turn this over to Ames.
So these are just basic concepts that I'm going to touch on just briefly, and these are will be very common to the existing board members, and perhaps more useful to those of you who are new. It's important to think of systems as a way to essentially link what you're doing at a system level with the campus level. And this, again, is a far more complicated picture than you normally have if you're dealing with a single institution. But the major areas are the system leadership, strategic leadership, and that involves a set of goal-setting activities and budget strategy with the system of accountability. But the most important thing to keep aligned in this whole system is resource allocation. And this will be a theme I'll touch on a couple of times in the next few minutes. There are more systems or not that actually pursue resource allocation without much consideration to strategic leadership and not too much attention to accountability. It can often be a train on its own track, but understanding how important it is to link all these things together in some systemic way. Another kind of example is you'll often visit a system and a campus level. I was talking about a state that I will be unmentioned this right now. If you visited the campus level and the leadership and the campus, in this case, president, there would be no sense of the connection of that campus with any broader systemic strategy. And again, from the points of view that's the perspective that Sally just shared, it's extremely important for these this to be working together and to be synchronized in a way that really brings they'll have a systemic effect for the benefits of students and the state. This is another just I would guess I've spent 16 years as a board member and chaired actually the board of a system like this. And I often found that I would get into issues and I think, oh, gee, this is a great idea. And then I'd make a disastrous mistake of saying, well, now this is how I would solve it. And as soon as I did that, I would suddenly realize that I'd lost most of the people in the room and the presidents. And I did it, and my fellow colleagues did, and we learned quickly how important it is to understand that the decisions about how something is going to be implemented really will take place sometimes at a system level, but much of the work will be done at the campus or through, in some respects, as you're working through on the community college, through teams which are put together to work explicitly on the implementation issues. This may be obvious to you all, but I know that it's very easy for boards to drift into how, and it's extremely important to understand that, in fact, the more you get into how, the more, in fact, you will impede the kind of implementation that needs to take place lower at other points in the system. Go to the next slide. This is somebody mentioned, gee, what does this slide mean? And therefore I thought I ought to give some explanation. It's, again, important to understand what kind of levers and tools a Board of Regents has to lead a system. And strategic leadership is a key part. And if I just underscore one point, it's really important to have a long-term vision about where you're going. And then to understand that the implementation of that vision will take place further down within the system. It will be a step-by-step process, but without a vision and overall direction, the step-by-step process in a complicated system will not be in sync with what the board really wants to get done. And the most important policy tools to get that done most likely are going to be finance policy and your accountability process. Ironically, most boards, in fact, turn to the policy tool of regulation more often than anything than budget process. They'll say, well, let's enact a policy that tells everybody to do something. If you ever talked about pushing on a rope and having no action, that often can be the action. If you don't really have the why and the what clear, having detailed regulations for this kind of system simply doesn't work. So those are the policy tools. I'm going to repeat the point about the budget process when we get into some of the issues. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Now, we've talked about common changes when in reality, what we're talking about is challenges. The first is linking goals and priorities to state priorities. If you look across the country and systems, the common practice continues to be a set of goals that are really inwardly focused. There's virtually no connection in the language that would actually, if the legislator or the governor looked at this and said, now, how does this really connect with the future of the state? You'd be hard pressed to do that. That isn't to say that the internal goals are not important. They are. However, it's the connection of what the system is doing to the future of the state and its regions is exceptionally important. And we'll give you an example of that later on in just a few minutes. An accountability system and metrics. Systems very often will have wonderful goals. They have virtually no way for a board to have really a consistent way of monitoring whether they're making progress. And I just trying to convey to you that this needs not to be such a complicated process that it becomes a train on a track. And see whether I can give you an example. I've been working with one complicated university system that's gone through a major transition and changes in presidents. And the question is, what are the 3 or 4 things that really need to focus the board's attention as it goes across multiple issues, including the next search for the president? The system has a strategic plan, but frankly, it hasn't been paying any attention to that. But ultimately, the board agreed that they really needed to have in front of them almost at every board meeting to saying what we're really about is these 3 or 4 things. And this is how we're really holding our system leadership and the campus heads and the whole system. These are the points for accountability. And frankly, they're accountability for us. As we come into a Board of Regents meeting, are we drifting off into other issues that are peripheral to what we really agreed is a major priority? So this is not an abstract thought. You really need to keep clearly focused on a limited number of things that are really important. Avoiding one size fits all. I think that Connecticut has been really very good at understanding this point. Systems have a very difficult time, particularly if you have a broad range of institutions, understanding that each institution in some respects has its own mission and culture. And then you have major differences, for example, between universities and community colleges. And as I've found in times, even on my own, the board I chair, that I'd have one board member who would say, oh yeah, I understand the system, but most of the questions that he was asking was actually from the institution, from the community from which he came. And he was generalizing all those problems to the other institutions. So constantly keeping a framework that you're talking about a statewide community college, and you're talking about 4 very different institutions. They have similarity in missions, but they serve different student populations. And finance policy, resource allocation, and the nature of local services really need to be differentiated. And then, frankly, going back to Sally's comments, how they're also linked together systemically. The budget process, and you have really good budget people we know well, so they understand these issues, is really what we constantly emphasize is the connection of that process, of the budget process, with the overall system goals and priorities. My colleague, Dennis Jones, constantly says if there is no plan, the budget is the plan. And in fact, you'll be driven by resource allocation methodology more than budget. Just to give you a concrete example, in a state we've just been discussing this past week. The state has a major priority for student completion and for collaboration and a set of other issues. Actually, the funding formula actually drives the institutions and faculty members to generate credit hours for traditional students, and in fact, not to pay any attention to issues of completion or collaboration in carrying out that task. So if you don't understand the basic incentives built into the funding policy and how they relate to your goals, one will undermine the other very quickly. The other point about strategic budget, and this is a repeated kind of issue, you'll find boards concentrating on expenditures for the coming year or for fiscal year, and then trying to balance the issue in sources of revenue, thinking about state appropriations and tuition revenue. And frankly, not paying very much attention to what we really call the balance sheet. And that is the condition of the overall assets of the institution. And that really recognizing probably the largest portion of the assets of the institution. You have a lot of physical assets, but the human resources of a system are incredibly important. And it's a constant question of saying, how are we developing, helping change and renew that critical resource? And that doesn't happen overnight. It happens almost at one position at a time. And so how one thinks of that is that you constantly think not only of revenue and expenditures, but are you deliberately investing to support major change initiatives, budgeting for a contingency, and thinking about how to use money on the margin to affect change throughout the system. Just as one point right now with funds available for the CARES Act, states are really faced a challenge of, do I use that for current expenditures, or do I try to use some of those funds to in fact bring about necessary changes? So when you fall off the cliff of those funds not available, in fact, you've assisted the system change to be more affordable and effective. So anyway, the system change, and it goes back to Sally's point about how systems are changed. A lot of the emphasis of early systems was on essentially economies of scale, on basically within the system. And what's happening now is much more of an emphasis on collaboration on academic policy across systems, but not only within the system, but also in collaboration with partners outside the system. It's really important to see how a system is in fact working with other institutions. I just go back to the point about origins of systems. Transfer and articulation has often been one of the major sources of frustration. Transfer and articulation does not happen only within your system. And working with others to in fact ensure that the students can move through to their goals using multiple providers is a major role for the system, even though it may be with other partners. And again, workforce development and K-12 are important. Support for institutional leaders. I'm not using an example that is local, but there are more cases than not where systems, frankly, have been asleep at the switch. I'm thinking of another system where, in fact, an institution's accreditation was at risk, and the accreditors sort of unloaded upon or focused primarily on that institution's president, holding that individual totally accountable for the conditions in which the institution faced. Not mentioned in the accreditor's comments was that institution was part of a system. And in fact, the governing board of that system was the entity legally responsible for the sustainability of that campus. So this is a question of careful monitoring, making sure that you understand the financial challenges of each of your institutions, and understanding that the changes that are going to needed are largely going to have to take place at the campus level. That's hard work, which requires engagement of multiple constituencies, and so support for institutional leaders is especially important. The final point is on processes, and I just can't emphasize this enough. I've seen, observed, and participated in enough change initiatives that were totally logical, sound beautiful, but implemented in a way that really ignored the reality of that first chart about the hierarchical realities. It is extremely important to engage a broad range of constituencies in an open, transparent process, building trust among the major parties and bringing about systemic change. And I know this is never an easy process. There will always be voices that are concerned about a change, but there are enough examples around the country where there has not been attention to this lesson. And I think that those of you involved in changes in Connecticut are well aware of this, but in terms of looking at other states, if there's ever an example, that's an important point that I just want to stress. The final point, which really illustrates Sally's slides about change. Systems in the past were inwardly focused, often administrative units for largely independent institutions. They not only have become much more systemic within the system, but much more connected with a broader range of constituencies all on behalf of increasing opportunities and of the life chances in the economy of the states in which they're located. This is much more of a leadership role, not only internally, but the leadership of the system in partnership with others, the other higher ed institutions, public and private, but also business, industry, state government. You, in fact, are on the board of probably the institution with or the entity with the greatest chance for impact on the future of Connecticut. I don't think that's an understatement. It's incredible responsibility. And as you work on your internal changes, you can be a major force for the future of Connecticut. And I think that's really the exciting part of the new sort of system role. Then the final point, we were asked about an example, and I want to begin by underscoring the first slide. Examples from other places can be helpful. They also can be not helpful. There are major differences between Maine and Connecticut, and all sorts of dimensions. Not the least of which, of course, is Maine is a vast geographic area, and Connecticut is, relatively self-contained, but very diverse within its own ways. But what Maine faced was a problem of too many institutions spread over a broad area and diminishing state resources, and then the kind of intense competition that Sally mentioned. And really the sustainability of opportunities in regions and parts of that state that if in fact they weren't brought together in a systemic way, there would be major gaps in opportunity and major issues for the system. So that Maine undertook a process begun several years ago of trying to bring about systemic change. And if I can again, the last point there of moving from 8 dispersed institutions to what the chancellor at that point talked about, 1 university. What's interesting today is how different the priorities are. Before, the priorities would have been totally internal to the university. But if you can see these systemic priorities, which I think date back to about 2018, of advancing workforce readiness and economic development, increasing Maine's education attainment, aligning academic programs with innovation and driving student success and employer responsiveness, and maintaining competitiveness and sustainability to meet these needs. Virtually every one of those goals can only be achieved through incredible collaboration across campuses, but frankly, working with the independent sector and with business and industry across the state. So Maine is probably a best example of trying to shift to a new role, a systemic role, given the economic realities at state. But it's also an example of how difficult it is to bring about the kind of change we're talking about. It requires, I would say, consistent, persistent pursuing of a vision and understanding it as a step-by-step process with lots of efforts to get you off track. But keeping focused on 2 or 3 major objectives and supporting your leaders to bring about that change is really the critical point. So with that, Sally and I are open to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you for a really helpful presentation and overview. And I'm sure it inspires many questions and observations. One I wanted to ask you, President Chang has joined us recently, and one of the things I know that he sees as his job is to work with this board on sort of the next chapter of our strategy here. And I'm wondering what you see as being a reasonable strategic timeline in the changing world around us, but the slow to change world that is us. 3 years, 5 years. I've had business leaders say, don't ask me to do a strategic plan after the past 3 years because I just don't know. And that was before the pandemic. So I just wondered what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I'm going to give you just a quick try, but this is not an instant, and doing it on the fly would be difficult. But let me give you two kinds of things that are important. Strategic planning to get broad buy-in across the system as a process is no doubt important. But unfortunately, I've found it extremely difficult for that to come down to something that leads to what I described earlier, as to say, what are the 3 or 4 things that really need to focus the attention of the Board of Regents and the president in leading the system? There's, and again, I'm thinking of specific examples that are going through my mind where you have an extremely complicated, time-consuming strategic planning process, coming up with some goals and then sort of measures, and then, but a process taking almost a couple of years, and then finding that really not to be that useful to the Board of Regents and the president in setting priorities. It is to a degree in that you've had some consensus, but I want to give you just I have one system in mind in that. This system is in a state with major disparities in education attainment. There are very differences in the extent to which the institutions are responding to that change. It's a state with major problems of state support and increasing tuition dependence, so affordability is a major issue, but also major differences among the institutions in the manifestation of that. It's a state in which this particular system could have a major statewide impact way beyond where its institutions are located. So there's a leadership role. The points that I just mentioned only vaguely came up in the strategic planning process. They tend to be internally focused. The truth is this board has a major challenge on related to opportunity of underserved populations in this state, the role of that it's really playing on equity. But it also has an incredible problem of deferred maintenance. One of the campuses has up to a $900 million deferred maintenance process that will take years to unravel. That didn't even come up in the strategic planning process. So I think you need to, given the urgency of your time, there's a real question of whether you need to come to agreement as a board on areas of focus. They're likely to be things you've been working on for years. But saying, among all the things we're doing, these are 3 or 4 areas that are being major goals. And certainly you need to make sure that in enunciating those, you give multiple opportunities for your multiple constituents to weigh in on their views about it. But it's not necessarily going out to everybody and saying, what do you think? And then sort of summing it up in a strategic plan. But I think it would be possible, recognizing the priorities facing the state and the system, for you to come up at least with a draft set of things. These are the points that we're really focusing on. Now that's Ames McGinnis said on the fly, but I'm just thinking of the practicalities of time and resources in the process. Is that helpful, sir?
It is, thank you. And I do want to also just clarify, because I was not clear in the way I asked the question, there is the challenge that you, I think, were commenting on of the process, the timeline for the process. And then what I was actually wondering about is, what is a reasonable planning horizon? So our plan is a 3-year plan starting at the point at which that process is complete, or is it a 5-year plan or 10, that's kind of what I was getting at.
Right. If the timeline for a plan, first of all, you've got to think of the state budget process. One of the things we've had a lot of discussion with is with even the state budget officers is in fact getting strategic budgeting into the state budget process. So thinking of the timing you've got to have in order to, in terms of the budget process. The second consideration is the reality of the time it takes to bring about change. And most of the systemic changes are going to take you probably 2 to 3 to 4 years to implement. So having, long-range goals and maybe intermediate goals may be more important, saying this is a long-range goal, but then a time of saying by this point, we should have moved to this point. Does that make sense, sir?
Thank you. And Sally, I think you may have wanted to amplify a little bit.
Just a tiny bit to say there is no time. Things are changing around us so quickly that while a process needs to be deliberative, it has to happen quickly, number one. And number two, I want to reinforce Ames's point that you should have or think about longer range plans, but then more immediate strategies or strategic goals that can have actual outcomes that can be measured.
Yeah, benchmarks with things that.
All right, thank you. Kelly Valeris, our head of workforce here in Connecticut. It's great to have you on the board now, Kelly, and I see you have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have more of a comment. I really appreciate this presentation today. Thinking about systems being broader than the CSCU system, we are really poised at a time that is unprecedented that I can remember, and the stakeholders that I speak to, as to the level of engagement of our companies in the state of Connecticut and how much they want to take on a role to support the CSCU system to being demand driven. And supporting what it takes to get there for their students, that the state has an unprecedented amount of dollars to support training programs for people who are underserved and underrepresented, and the support dollars that are associated with those programs as well, to really ensure that our non-traditional students have the supports that they need to get through a system that is effectively working for them. So I think, thinking about who our customers are, and I always think our end customer is the businesses that we serve in our community, and the product is our students. And we have to make sure that kind of the process we put our students through meets their needs for how they can engage in education with the constraints that they have. And in the community college system, servicing mostly non-traditional students, so we can't provide them traditional type scheduling and functions in the school system. So I'm really excited to engage in this conversation with the board and bring the state perspective and the business perspective to this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. I see Dr. Blitz and Aviva. So let's try to get you both in.
I'll be as brief as I can. I thought it was a very interesting presentation, and I particularly appreciate the critique of strategic planning, which Mr. McGinnis has just made. I think it's a very interesting problem of having many goals, but not any clearly defined strategic objectives, which will be worked on and focused upon. And I just wonder, my question is the following. The notion of not just systems, but systems of systems has been much discussed of late. It was first developed, as you know, in the U.S. military by Admiral Owens in the mid-1990s, and has now been picked up to a large extent in systems engineering, where it allows, in addition, for concepts such as emergent properties of systems and so forth. But for our purposes, it is interesting because it allows for the maintenance of the autonomy and integrity of constituent units while providing for overall strategic cooperation and coordination in order to achieve goals. So I wonder if you could comment on the system of systems concept.
Yeah, one of the dangers, one of the lessons I have in my mind is being careful about saying more than I know, which is always a dangerous thing. But let me just make this point, that as Sally's point about history illustrated, that systems in the past were, in fact, administrative structures for autonomous institutions. Today's reality is that the definition of autonomy, that has always been a relative concept. It's extremely important for there to be autonomy on some issues, increasingly important for there to be shared ways of getting other functions that used to be institution by institution done on a systemic basis. So it's one of the challenges for a system is to work out what can be best done through a shared basis, and those things that are essential to be done at the point of the interaction between faculty members and students and the point of delivery of services. So from that perspective, the system concept is really fundamentally changing in higher education across the country. The other point is a broader one. Higher ed institutions, as you know, are already the intersection of multiple systems. You as a faculty member are part of a system, your own discipline. There are systems of all sorts. This is an interaction from a sociological point of view of multiple systems. But from a higher ed system point of view, there are a set of intersecting. There's will be a system that's working on academic policy, another one that's working on shared services, another one on the connection of workforce. There are systems that are relationship in each region of how you relate. So I'm not sure whether that's responsive to your issue, but I think the concept in higher ed is fundamentally changed and changing.
Thank you, Ames. Regent Budd, time for
I'm
your
afraid
question,
that
and I'm going
my
to turn it
question
to
is
President
probably
Cheng
going
to wrap us up. Go ahead, Aviva.
Sorry, I want to thank you, and it's been very interesting. My question relates to something you said at the beginning. However, I think your response is going to take a lot more time. So I'll just throw the question out sometime. Maybe there's another way to respond. You mentioned that Vermont had a situation. Maybe I didn't understand it as clearly. I want to make sure I understand it. They have a single community college, but I assume that was a consolidation of multiple community college campuses, similar to what we're doing. And if I am correct, then the follow-up to that is, you mentioned that they had certain problems, and I was curious to know if the problems might be generic or something we could learn from, or if they were so specific to their community and geographic situation. But that's a long answer. So that's the question, and I'd like to hear more sometime.
Yeah, my answers have been too long. So quickly, actually the community college in Vermont is not at all parallel to your situation.
Okay.
It's almost it's an innovative situation in which they really have virtually had no campuses.
Okay.
And then so it's from a very beginning thing. Community College of Vermont has been a very innovative model with multiple sites throughout the state, supported by shared services and a very different idea about faculty. The part of Vermont that has some lessons, but probably not too many, is the complexity of dealing with what is now the University of Northern Vermont, being made part of a single university, including the Vermont Technical College and the other campus. And
could I suggest that the parallel would not be with Vermont in terms of what you all are doing with the community colleges, and more like Dallas County Community College District, which is almost the same in size as your state, and had multiple independent campuses that they brought together for economies of scale and, quite frankly, better success for students.
Thank you very much. We should look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are several other examples that Sally and I can give you that are at the community college level.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for your attention, and I know our time is up, and we'll be glad to answer questions online.
Thank you, Ames, and thank you, Sally. And it was super informative and super helpful. And again, just to kind of make sure we're not stuck in our own fishbowl. And I think many of your examples and many of your details in the presentation resonate with us. We're certainly swimming in that same stream. We're certainly engaging in some of those same challenges. And, so again, the context is great. And I think this is a great kind of, beginning of the conversation, certainly not the end. And I would say that for any board members who have questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to email them to Alice and to me, and we will make sure Ames and Sally get them and they can give a kind of response to that. But again, we just appreciate your work and your guidance and direction on this. And I think it was a really great start to our continuing and evolving process. So with that, Chair Fleury.
Pam, do we have a technical need for a motion to adjourn before we?
I got it.
There you go.
Thank
Good.
you.
Thank you.
President Chang, thank you. Clearly, it is just a kickoff on many of these things, and the board will be visiting these topics when we convene for strategic planning, process going forward. So thank you again, Ames and Sally, for your good work. We appreciate it very much, and I would just commend to the board the advance piece that was shared, which has a lot of details. Some of them are frankly quite involved and intricate, as seems to be this world, as they undertook the question of trying to compare states that are incomparable. So that's just really good reading, and the deck is great, and the discussion was good, and great questions raised. So thank you for that. To the board, I would like to request a motion and a second for adjournment.
I so move.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Hi,
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, so the meeting's adjourned. Thank you all.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Happy
Thank you.
Thanksgiving.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.